The people who change your life are rarely the ones you expect to notice you. Friday nights at Russo's were always loud. Crystal glasses reflected warm light from the chandeliers. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room. Expensive watches flashed beneath designer suit sleeves. Everyone seemed important. Everyone except me. I balanced a tray against my shoulder and moved between tables with practiced efficiency. After 2 years working at the restaurant, I had learned how to become invisible. Smile. Refill drinks. Deliver plates. Apologize when something went wrong, even when it was not your fault. Then move on to the next table. Most nights, that was enough. Tonight was different. I knew at the moment I walked through the front door. The atmosphere felt tense. A large private event occupied half the restaurant. Managers rushed between stations. Servers exchanged nervous looks. The kitchen moved at double speed. Somewhere near the back office, someone was already raising their voice. I took a slow breath and reminded myself to get through the shift. Just one more night. That was all. The evening passed in a blur of orders, conversations, and footsteps. Then, shortly after 8 o'clock, everything changed. A misunderstanding involving a reservation created confusion near one of the premium tables. Voices became louder. Several guests turned to watch. I tried to explain calmly. I tried to solve the problem. Instead, criticism seemed to come from every direction at once. The details hardly mattered. What mattered was the feeling. Standing in the middle of a crowded room while people made assumptions about you. Feeling dozens of eyes watching. Feeling your face grow warm while trying desperately to remain professional. I lowered my gaze and listened quietly. Arguing would only make things worse. It always did. Eventually, the situation ended. The guests were seated elsewhere. The restaurant continued moving. Conversations resumed. Music played again. Yet something inside me felt heavier than before. I retreated briefly to a service station near the kitchen and stared at the order screen. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From exhaustion. There is a difference. Fear passes. Exhaustion stays. Claire, a young dishwasher named Miguel, appeared beside me. Are you okay? I immediately forced a smile. I am fine. He looked unconvinced. You do not look fine. I laughed softly. That is because I need coffee. He smiled and returned to work. The moment he disappeared, my smile vanished. Across the dining room, hidden behind dark glass overlooking the restaurant, sat the private owner's booth. Most employees never paid attention to it. The owner rarely appeared. Rumors about him circulated constantly. Some people described him as intimidating. Others described him as brilliant. I had never spoken to him. In fact, I was not entirely sure I had ever seen him. Tonight, however, a faint light glowed behind the glass. Someone was inside, watching. I turned away and focused on my next table. There was no reason to think about it. No reason to imagine that the owner of one of New York's most successful restaurant groups would notice a waitress struggling through a difficult shift. I picked up another tray and stepped back onto the floor. What I did not know was that high above the dining room, inside the private booth, Damian Russo had been watching the security cameras for the last 20 minutes. And for the first time all evening, he was asking a question nobody else had bothered to ask. Who is that girl? Power does not announce itself. Sometimes it simply stands up, and the entire room changes. I did not notice the shift immediately. At first, everything seemed normal. The restaurant remained busy. Orders continued arriving from the kitchen. Glasses clinked softly beneath warm chandelier light. Guests laughed over expensive dinners. Yet something felt different. The managers were suddenly moving faster. Servers exchanged confused glances. Conversations near the hostess stand became quieter. I balanced another tray against my shoulder and approached table 12 when I noticed several employees looking toward the center of the dining room. Not staring. Watching. Waiting. Curiosity pulled my attention in the same direction. A tall man wearing a dark tailored suit had emerged from a private hallway near the owner's section. He walked slowly through the restaurant, calm and composed. No security team surrounded him. No dramatic entrance announced his arrival. Yet every person who noticed him seemed to straighten slightly. The atmosphere changed without a single word being spoken. I recognized him immediately from photographs I had seen online. Damian Russo. For a moment I simply stared. Not because he was famous. Because I had worked here for 2 years and never expected to see him in person. He moved through the dining room with quiet confidence, acknowledging staff members with small nods. Nothing about him felt rushed. Nothing felt forced. Yet somehow the entire restaurant seemed to orbit around his presence. I quickly looked away and focused on my table. Whatever was happening had nothing to do with me. At least that was what I assumed. 5 minutes later, I was delivering desserts when the floor manager approached. His expression looked unusually nervous. "Claire." I blinked. "Yes." He cleared his throat. "Mr. Russo would like to see you." I nearly dropped the dessert plate. "What?" "In his office." For several seconds I honestly thought he was joking. The manager was not smiling. My stomach tightened immediately. Had I done something wrong? Was I being fired? Had someone complained? 100 possibilities raced through my mind at once. "Now?" I asked. "Now?" The manager offered an awkward smile that failed to reassure me. I handed off the dessert and followed him through the restaurant. Every step felt heavier than the last. Employees glanced up as we passed. Some looked surprised. Others looked confused. None of them seemed to understand what was happening. Neither did I. We stopped outside a large wooden door near the private offices. The manager knocked once. A calm voice answered from inside. "Come in." The manager opened the door and stepped aside. I entered alone. Damien Russo stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Evening lights reflected across the glass behind him. His office felt surprisingly simple. Elegant. Organized. Quiet. He turned toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his gaze settled on my face with surprising focus. Not intimidating. Observant. Like he was trying to understand something. Finally, he gestured toward a chair. "Please sit down, Claire." I obeyed automatically. My pulse refused to cooperate. Damien sat across from me and folded his hands together. "Do you know why you are here?" I shook my head. "No, sir." A faint expression crossed his face. Not amusement. Something closer to disappointment. Then he said the last thing I expected to hear. "I spent 20 minutes reviewing security footage tonight." My heart immediately sank. But before I could speak, Damien leaned forward slightly and added, "And I know what really happened." For a second, I forgot how to breathe. The office suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. The city lights beyond the window blurred together as I stared at Damien across the desk. He remained calm. Completely calm. As if the sentence he had just spoken was the most ordinary thing in the world. I know what really happened. My first instinct was embarrassment. Not relief. Not gratitude. Embarrassment. Because being misunderstood hurt. Being seen felt even more terrifying. I looked down at my hands. "Then you know it was a misunderstanding." Damien studied me carefully. "Yes." His answer came immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. "You tried to solve the situation professionally." My throat tightened. "I did. I know." The words landed harder than I expected. Nobody had said that all evening. Nobody had bothered asking for my side of the story. They had simply assumed. Damien leaned back slightly. "What surprised me was not what happened." I frowned. "Then what surprised you?" His gaze remained steady. "Your reaction." Confusion crossed my face. Damien noticed. Most people would have defended themselves. I laughed softly. There was no humor in it. That usually makes things worse. Something shifted in his expression. Understanding. "So you stayed quiet." I nodded. It seemed easier. Silence settled between us. The ticking of a clock somewhere in the office became suddenly noticeable. Finally, Damien stood and walked toward a tablet resting on a side table. He tapped the screen once before turning it toward me. Security footage appeared. The dining room. The reservation confusion. The conversation. The entire sequence unfolded exactly as I remembered. Watching it felt strange. Like observing someone else's life. Damien paused the recording. "You handled it well." I stared at the screen. "I do not think anyone else agrees." "I do." His voice was firm enough to stop any argument before it began. For the first time that evening, I looked directly at him. Damien Russo possessed the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Yet there was no arrogance in the way he spoke. No performance. Just certainty. He believed what he was saying. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. "Why does this matter so much?" I asked quietly. Damien looked toward the restaurant below. Employees moved between tables beneath golden lights. Guests enjoyed their dinners completely unaware of the conversation happening above them. Because culture matters. He turned back toward me. A business becomes what it tolerates. The answer caught me off guard. Damien continued. If good employees are blamed for situations they did not create, eventually they stop caring. Then the entire place suffers. I blinked. He was not speaking only about me. He was speaking about principles. about responsibility, about leadership. Suddenly, a knock interrupted the conversation. The floor manager entered looking nervous. Damien motioned for him to come inside. The manager obeyed immediately. His eyes briefly met mine before returning to Damien. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Damien nodded. "Yes." The room grew noticeably quieter. Then Damien made a decision that would change everything. He looked at the manager and said, "Tomorrow morning, I want the entire leadership team in the conference room." The manager swallowed. "May I ask why?" Damien's expression never changed. "Because Claire deserves an apology, and I intend to make sure everyone understands exactly what happened tonight." The next morning arrived far too quickly. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the conversation in Damien's office. The security footage, the apology he intended to demand, the certainty in his voice when he said I deserved better. Nobody had ever spoken to me like that before. By 8 o'clock, I was standing outside the conference room holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Managers moved through the hallway carrying tablets and folders. Some looked nervous. Others looked confused. None of them seemed happy about being called into an early meeting. I understood the feeling. The conference room overlooked the city through enormous windows. Sunlight reflected off nearby buildings, filling the room with bright morning light. When I entered, several people glanced toward me before quickly looking away. The reaction immediately made me uncomfortable. I chose a seat near the end of the table and hoped nobody would pay attention to me. Unfortunately, that was impossible. 5 minutes later, Damien Russo walked into the room. Every conversation stopped. Every chair straightened. Every phone disappeared from sight. Power did not need to announce itself. It simply entered the room. Damien took a seat at the head of the table and looked around slowly, calmly, patiently. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then he spoke. "Thank you for coming." His voice remained measured and controlled. Nobody interrupted. Damien tapped a button on the conference room screen. Security footage appeared. My stomach tightened immediately. Several managers exchanged confused looks. The video began playing. The reservation issue. The misunderstanding. The entire situation unfolded exactly as it had happened. No exaggeration. No missing context. Just facts. When the footage ended, the room remained silent. Damien folded his hands together. Would anyone like to explain why an employee was blamed for a problem she did not create? Nobody answered. A manager near the middle of the table shifted uncomfortably. Another stared at the screen. The floor manager from the previous night finally cleared his throat. "We acted too quickly." Damien nodded once. "Yes." The manager continued. "We made assumptions." "Yes." The room grew even quieter. Damien looked around the table. Leadership is not about finding someone to blame. It is about finding the truth. Nobody argued. Nobody could. The evidence was sitting on the screen behind him. Then something happened that surprised me. Damien turned toward me. "Claire." My heart immediately accelerated. "Yes." His expression softened slightly. "Would you stand, please?" Confused, I rose from my chair. Every eye in the room followed me. Normally, I would have hated that. Today felt different. Damien looked toward the management team. This employee remained professional under pressure. She protected the reputation of this restaurant despite being treated unfairly. The room remained silent. That deserves recognition, not criticism. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the floor manager stood. "Claire, I owe you an apology." Another manager stood. Then another. One by one, every member of leadership acknowledged what happened. I felt overwhelmed, embarrassed, grateful, uncertain. Most of all, I felt seen. When the meeting finally ended, employees slowly filed out of the room. Soon only Damien and I remained. I looked at him across the conference table. "You did not have to do all of this." Damien studied me for a moment. Then he asked a question I was completely unprepared to answer. "Claire, why do you always act like you deserve less than everyone else?" The question stayed in the air between us long after Damien asked it. Sunlight poured through the conference room windows, reflecting off the glass towers outside. The city moved on as if nothing important had happened. But for me, everything felt different. I looked down at the conference table and traced a finger along the wood grain. "I do not know," I said quietly. The answer was not entirely true. I knew exactly where it started. I just rarely talked about it. Damien remained silent, waiting, listening. Somehow he always seemed to know when silence was more useful than advice. I took a slow breath. When I was younger, my mother worked 2 jobs. My eyes remained fixed on the table. She never complained, never asked anyone for anything. She just kept going. Memories surfaced one after another. Small apartment, late-night dinners, bills stacked on the kitchen counter. My mother smiling even when she was exhausted. She used to tell me that nobody owes you anything. If you want a better life, you work for it. Damien nodded slightly. That is not bad advice. No. I smiled faintly. But somewhere along the way, I think I misunderstood it. The room grew quiet again. I stopped asking for help altogether. Saying it aloud made the truth impossible to ignore. I convinced myself that needing help meant failing. Damien leaned back in his chair. His expression remained thoughtful. And when people treated you unfairly? I laughed softly. I told myself to work harder. When people overlooked your contributions, I worked harder. When they made assumptions, I looked up and met his eyes. I worked harder. For the first time, Damien actually smiled. Not because it was funny, because he finally understood the pattern. Claire, that is not humility. His voice was calm. That is survival. The word struck deeper than I expected. Survival. Maybe that was exactly what it had been. For years I had measured success by how much I could endure without complaining, how much I could carry without breaking, how little space I occupied in other people's lives. Damien stood and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Do you know what I saw when I reviewed those cameras? He asked. I shook my head. I saw someone protecting the reputation of this restaurant even when nobody protected her. Emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. He continued looking out at the city. That kind of loyalty is rare. Then he turned toward me. Do you know what else is rare? I waited. Someone who remains kind after being disappointed repeatedly. For a moment I could not speak. Because nobody had ever described me that way before. Most people noticed mistakes, problems, weaknesses. Damien seemed determined to notice something else. The good things I barely acknowledged myself. Finally I stood and gathered my bag. Thank you, I said quietly. Damien looked genuinely puzzled. For what? I smiled. For seeing me. Something changed in his expression then. Something almost impossible to read. Respect. Admiration. Maybe both. As I reached the door, Damien spoke again. Claire. I paused. Yes. His gaze remained steady. There is something about you that everyone in this building has missed. My heartbeat quickened. What? A faint smile appeared. I intend to find out what it is. People reveal themselves in unexpected ways when nobody knows they are being watched. 3 days passed after the meeting. Life at the restaurant returned to normal on the surface. Orders arrived. Guests filled tables. Music floated through the dining room. Yet something had changed. Employees greeted me differently. Managers listened more carefully. For the first time since I started working there, I felt visible. Not famous. Not important. Just visible. The strange part was that Damien seemed to disappear. After our conversation in the conference room, I did not see him again. His office remained occupied. Meetings continued. Executives came and went. But Damien himself stayed out of sight. At first I barely noticed. Then I started noticing far too much. One afternoon Miguel approached me while I organized menus near the hostess stand. Can I ask you something? I laughed. That usually means trouble. He grinned. Why did Mr. Russo ask about you? My hands froze. What? Miguel shrugged. A few days ago somebody from corporate called. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. And they asked about everyone on staff. He paused. But they asked the most questions about you. I stared at him. What kind of questions? Volunteer work. Community projects. How long you have worked here. My confusion deepened. Why would Damien care about any of that? The answer arrived later that evening. My shift ended around 9. As I left through the employee entrance, I noticed an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags near the corner. Without thinking, I crossed the street and helped carry them to her apartment building 2 blocks away. It was not unusual. I had done similar things my entire life. Small acts. Forgotten 5 minutes later. The following afternoon, I was called to the administrative office. When I arrived, a regional director I had never met before offered me a seat. Miss Bennett, she said warmly. How many volunteer programs are you currently involved in? I blinked. 3. Her eyebrows rose. Only 3. I frowned. Only. She opened a folder. My eyes widened immediately. Inside were records. Literacy drives. Food bank events. Community tutoring programs. Fundraisers. Charity auctions. Years of volunteer work I barely remembered. Where did you get this? The director smiled. Mr. Russo asked us to take a closer look. My heart skipped. Suddenly, the comment Damien made in the conference room echoed inside my mind. I intend to find out what it is. He had not been investigating my mistakes. He had been investigating my life. The realization left me speechless. Later that night, as I prepared to leave, I noticed a familiar figure standing alone in the dining room after closing. Damien. The restaurant was empty except for a few employees cleaning tables. Warm light reflected across polished wood floors. He looked up as I approached. I think you have been researching me, I said. A faint smile appeared. Research is a strong word. I folded my arms. Then what would you call it? Damien studied me for a moment before answering. Verification. Confusion crossed my face. He continued. I wanted to know whether the person I saw on those security cameras was real. My heartbeat quickened. And Damien looked directly into my eyes. Claire, everything they said about you was wrong. The truth is much more impressive. The truth has a strange way of changing a room once everyone finally hears it. A week after my conversation with Damien, the atmosphere inside Russo's felt completely different. Employees smiled more. Managers listened more carefully. Even guests seemed to notice the energy had changed. For the first time since I started working there, I looked forward to coming to work. Not because the job itself had changed, because the people had. One Thursday afternoon, the entire staff received an invitation to a company meeting before opening hours. Nobody knew why. Speculation spread through the restaurant all morning. New policies, expansion plans, management changes. Everyone had a theory. At 4 o'clock, nearly 50 employees gathered in the private event room overlooking the city. Conversations filled the space until Damien entered. The room immediately fell silent. He stood at the front beside a large screen displaying the Russo Hospitality logo. Calm, composed, effortlessly in control. I took a seat near the back and hoped to remain unnoticed. I should have known better. Damien began by discussing company values. Respect, accountability, integrity, the usual corporate language. Then the presentation changed. Photographs appeared on the screen behind him. Community events, volunteer programs, literacy drives, food bank fundraisers, tutoring sessions. My stomach immediately dropped. I recognized every image. Because I was in them. The room shifted around me. Employees exchanged confused looks. Some turned toward my table. Others stared at the screen. Damien continued speaking. A few weeks ago, I reviewed an incident that occurred in one of our restaurants. Nobody moved. During that review, I discovered something important. Another photograph appeared. Me organizing donated books for children. Then another. And another. Years of volunteer work unfolded across the screen. Sometimes, Damien said, the people creating the most value are the people receiving the least recognition. The room remained completely silent. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. Instead, Damien continued. Claire Bennett has spent years helping communities across this city without asking for attention, recognition, or reward. My face felt warm. Every employee in the room was staring now. Miguel looked delighted. Several managers looked stunned. Damien glanced briefly in my direction before returning his attention to the staff. When assumptions were made about her, many people accepted them without asking questions. The words were not angry. Somehow that made them more powerful. That will not happen again. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could. Then Damien did something I never expected. He stepped away from the podium and looked directly at me. Claire, would you join me for a moment? My pulse immediately accelerated. Slowly, I stood and walked to the front of the room. The silence felt enormous. Damien waited until I reached him. Then he turned toward the staff. Character matters. His voice carried easily across the room. And character deserves recognition. Applause started somewhere near the middle of the audience. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Not politely, genuinely. I stood frozen beside Damien while dozens of people smiled in my direction. Some looked embarrassed by how wrong they had been. Others simply looked proud. As the applause continued, Damien leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. I told you everyone missed something. I looked at him, and a faint smile appeared. Now they finally see it. Sometimes the opportunities that change your life arrive disguised as a simple question. 2 days after the staff meeting, I received a message asking me to come to the corporate office on my day off. My first thought was that something had gone wrong. My second thought was that Damien was involved. Both thoughts followed me all the way to the top floor of Russo Hospitality headquarters. The receptionist greeted me warmly and directed me toward a conference room overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the space with afternoon sunlight. A long table stretched through the center of the room. Several executives sat reviewing documents. Damien stood near the window, speaking quietly with a senior director. When he noticed me, he immediately ended the conversation. "Claire." I nodded. "You wanted to see me?" A faint smile appeared. "Yes." That was all he said. Typical Damien. I took a seat and waited. One of the executives distributed folders around the table. When mine arrived, I opened it and immediately froze. Across the top page were the words Community Engagement Director. My eyes moved to the detailed proposal beneath it. Expanded literacy programs, volunteer partnerships, scholarship initiatives, restaurant-sponsored community projects across multiple boroughs. The scope was enormous. I looked up in disbelief. "What is this?" Damien sat across from me. "An opportunity." I stared at the folder again. "This is not an opportunity. This is an entire department." Several executives smiled. Damien remained serious. "It should be." My heart began beating faster. "You cannot be offering this to me." "Why not?" The question caught me off guard. "Because I am a waitress." The room grew quiet. Damien leaned back slightly. "No." His voice remained calm. "You are a leader who happens to work as a waitress." I looked away immediately. Hearing someone describe me that way felt impossible. Unreal. Yet nobody around the table seemed surprised. In fact, several executives nodded in agreement. One of them spoke up. "We reviewed your volunteer history." Another smiled. "The number of people you have organized is remarkable." A third executive added. "Most candidates spend years building resumes to demonstrate this kind of experience." I sat speechless. For years I had viewed those projects as small acts of service. Things people did because they cared. Apparently everyone else saw something different. Damien slid another document across the table. "The position is yours if you want it." I looked down. Full authority over community partnerships. A dedicated team. Resources beyond anything I had ever imagined. Every dream I quietly carried for years suddenly sat on paper in front of me. The room waited for my answer. I looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. Then toward Damien. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment nobody spoke. Damien held my gaze steadily. "Because talent should be recognized." His answer sounded simple. Honest. Final. Emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. Not because of the position. Because for the first time in my life, someone with power was using it to open a door instead of close one. I looked back at the offer. Then I smiled. "I accept." Relief flashed across several faces. Applause followed almost immediately. Damien's expression softened into the smallest smile. Yet as everyone celebrated around the table, I noticed something unexpected. He seemed happier about my future than his own success. And for the first time, I began wondering whether changing my life had never been the real goal. Maybe, without either of us realizing it, I had already started changing his. 6 months later, I stood in the center of a crowded community hall watching hundreds of people celebrate the launch of a citywide education and volunteer initiative. Children filled reading corners. Families gathered around activity tables. Teachers, local leaders, and volunteers moved through the building with excited smiles. Everywhere I looked, people were connecting, learning, and building something meaningful together. Sometimes I still had trouble believing it was real. The position Damien offered had changed my life. Not because of the title, not because of the office, because it gave me the chance to turn years of quiet ideas into reality. Programs that once existed only in notebooks now served neighborhoods across New York. Scholarship funds had been created. Reading centers had opened. Volunteer networks had expanded beyond anything I imagined. Yet the thing that changed most was not my career. It was me. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer believed that asking for help was weakness. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could endure alone. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "You are doing it again." I turned and smiled immediately. Damien stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, watching the crowd. Some things never changed. "Thinking too much?" I asked. "Always." A faint smile appeared on his face. We walked together toward a balcony overlooking the event below. Evening sunlight poured through the glass walls, covering the room in gold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the people enjoying something that had once seemed impossible. Finally, I looked at him. Do you know what is strange? Damien raised an eyebrow. Many things. I laughed. Fair. The sound came easily now. The night everything changed started with the worst shift of my life. Damien nodded slowly. I remember. I thought that night would be the reason I quit. My gaze moved across the crowd below. Instead, it became the reason I found my future. Silence settled comfortably between us. Then Damien spoke. Sometimes the worst day points you toward the right life. I looked at him and realized how much he had changed too. The man who once observed everyone from a distance now spent more time supporting community projects than attending corporate events. He still carried the same quiet authority, the same presence that could silence a room. But there was something warmer there now, something lighter. You changed this company, I said softly. Damien shook his head. No. His gaze remained on me. You did. Emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. Not because of the compliment, because I finally believed it. The applause rising from below pulled our attention back toward the event. People were celebrating the success of programs that would continue helping others long after the evening ended. Damien extended his hand toward the crowd below. Ready? He asked. I smiled. For what? His expression softened. For the next chapter. Together we walked back into the light. And as the room welcomed us with applause and laughter, I realized the most important decision Damien Russo ever made was not the one that changed my career. It was the moment he chose to see the truth when everyone else accepted assumptions. Power had protected me. Justice had restored me. But being truly seen had transformed my life. And sometimes that is how happy endings begin.